But to find out what it is about, right? For those of you that haven't watched this in like 30 years, those of you watching along with us, or those of you who aren't watching and just listening to our wonderful, beautiful, soothing voices, Brent Allen is going to tell us what this was actually about. Brent, tell us about the episode.
Well, it's another week on Babylon 5, which means we're getting some more shady people coming to the station. This time it's a pair of guys who have arrived separately, but they're winking and nodding at each other. But they're winking and nodding at each other, so that definitely means they're up to something. And that something is kidnapping Sinclair and using some kind of a weird mind probe to find out answers to this question. Why did the Minbari pull back during the war at the Battle of the Line? It's some Matrix-like stuff going on inside Sinclair's brain. And while he's reliving those last moments of the war, he's fighting it, something fierce. We learned that Sinclair was in charge of a large platoon of fighters, and they were in a tough spot, getting killed left and right, and Sinclair finally decides to go full-on kamikaze on them. But just before he rams into the Minbari ship, he gets flashy-thinged, and the Minbari pull him into their ship and proceed to torture him, it seems like, for a few days. And we also learned that aboard ship during that time was the Grey Council. You know, that whole thing Delenn was supposed to be a part of. At least that's who we're to assume it is. And that means Delenn was also there, and she had the weird triangle thing on her head that all the rest of them do, and was a big symbol throughout the course of this episode. It's right about then that Sinclair breaks out of the mind probe, and after a brief pew 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 fight where Sinclair thinks he's back in the war, he finally comes to his senses. And while he tells Delenn otherwise, Sinclair remembers everything this time, where there used to be a hole in his memory. But back with Delenn, one of the Grey Council turns out is lurking in the back of her quarters because, sure, why not? And he's there telling Delenn that if Sinclair remembers so much as an iota, then he must die. So Sinclair's got a big secret he needs to keep, but he's got to find out why and what happened. He has to, Jeff. He has to.
He must.
He must.
He must. I'm going to tell you, Brent, I watched this episode twice, as is my custom, to get ready for this podcast. And my reaction that I had initially is different than the reaction I had after I watched it the second time. But I still really got a lot out of this. But what's interesting on reflection, so here's kind of where I landed after watching it the second time. I love that we know more about what happened at the Battle of the Line, that we got to see it, that we met we met the memory of one of his shipmates, soldiers that he flew with.
The Tom Riddle from the diary. Mitchell. Yeah, that's who we met. Yeah.
I mean, it's exactly, yep. But really, we didn't learn anything new in this. This confirmed everything that we know, and now Sinclair knows everything that we know. He did a log entry that's the cap of this episode. The end was him doing a log entry that was about, 45 seconds long, I think. You could have listened to that. It gave you everything that happened in this episode.
But then we wouldn't have had an episode.
Exactly. We had to step through the whole thing, right? And do all this stuff. Right. Now, what the show did for me, though, is I kind of learned a thing about me watching this. And that thing I learned, Brent, I kind of love this show. Like, I felt a real connection to Sinclair. I felt the anxiety and the tension when he was like falling through the corridors, when he was thinking he was back in the war. There's that security guard that came out that he took a shot at. And I felt that. I was just like, oh my gosh. And then you saw like the way they cut with Delenn coming down a hallway while I'm like, oh my gosh, he's going to shoot Delenn. Like, this is going to go. I was so pulled into that the first time I watched this episode that my takeaway was, I love this show. It's great.